Oops, no, there. Oh, what happened then? Did I do something wrong? There, sorry. Share screen, there we go. And there we go. There we go. I hope everybody now can see the slides, which I shall be going through to present the good practice guidelines for the enterprise risk management function, which were completed and published at the, I think it was January or February this year. Just brief thought here. Why did we call it good practice guidelines? Well, what we wanted to say was, often one talks about best practice, but what we were wanting to communicate here was that this is, in our opinion, good practice. It may not be the absolute best, but this is, if you like, a solid minimum that we should expect. And I would just like to explain why we developed the guidelines originally, and going on with our Nordic-Baltic cooperation. We wanted, and that was our aim, was to provide a benchmark. And as this was a cooperation project between IAA institutes, it was important because for IAA members and for the working of internal audit, we are expected to understand risk management. And how can we understand risk management if we don't have some sort of benchmark or guidelines to help us in that respect? So we felt there was a need there. We also felt that when you look at what the duties of an internal auditor is, that we as internal auditors must evaluate the effectiveness and contribute to the improvement of risk management processes. And how can you do that again if you don't have any benchmark that you can measure against? Then it's just my opinion based on my background, but it doesn't have the weight of this is what a number of people have agreed on who are knowledgeable in the field. And furthermore, on the governance processes, we also have to see that risk management is being appropriately managed, and there is appropriate oversight of risk management. So that was sort of the background incentive for developing these guidelines. And we hope it will be useful, obviously, to internal audit practitioners, but also to those who work in risk management. When we sort of just did a sort of quick comparison of internal audit and ERM, or enterprise risk management, you can see that internal audit has the privilege of being established as an institute for a long time, 80 years, or more than 80 years now, and it's a global body which also sets its own standards and so on. So if you, as an individual, want to know what is internal auditing about, there are professional standards and an international standards. Whereas enterprise risk management, that is not the same. It's been developing over the last 15, 20 years. Obviously, COSO ERM was a very important factor in the development of enterprise risk management. But there is no sort of internationally accepted standard body. And although there are professional associations, they're not global. I know from my own case in Norway that there is a risk management institute, but it has quite a narrow focus on risk management in connection with insurance. So there is no institute which tries to gather all those who are working in the profession of risk management. And there are standards, but of which ISO 31000 and the COSO framework are perhaps the most important. So there are standards out there, but which, although there are two different standards there, one coming out of the US and one coming out of an international body, they say pretty much the same thing, but in different ways, in different words and in a different conceptual framework. Originally, we developed guidelines in Norway, which we just called for the risk management function. And our incentive in Norway was, well, I was going to say our inspiration was the fact that we have a compliance network in Norway, and they sat down and wrote, this is what we believe the compliance function is. And so we felt the challenge there from the risk management environment, well, let's sit down and try and develop our guidelines also for the risk management function. And then having translated that into English with them, we talked to colleagues in the Nordic and Baltic countries, and we said, well, why don't we make something that all of us in the Nordic and Baltic countries can say, well, this is what we feel is a benchmark, this is what we feel is good practice. And so that was developed further from the original beginning in Norway. The way we did it was that we had a working group with members from one member from each country. We tried actually to meet virtually, but it wasn't always so easy. But so we used email a lot and sent to each other and got comments and did revised versions and achieved a final agreed version. And as I say, we also feel that this good practice guidelines could be valuable for those who are thinking about establishing a enterprise risk management function, or who wish to develop further their existing risk management function. Just for those who maybe have read the original or Norwegian version, you will see that there were made changes. We explicitly state enterprise risk management. And as I say, also we talked about good practice guidelines, because we felt we wanted to say that this is sort of not something extreme to try and achieve, as one might feel with best practice, but that this is good practice. We also felt that we should develop more clearly what a chief risk officer's role is. So I'd specifically mention the chief risk officer, whereas before in the original guidelines, we just talked about a function. We added an additional section on how we should cooperate between internal audit and risk management. We restructured the guidelines in the sense that we put a lot of the more background information, the more on risk management topics into appendices. So we're saying that the actual guidelines are more and that the additional guidance, because as I said earlier, we were also thinking if you were going to establish an enterprise risk management function, we wanted to put in enough to sort of say, well, these are important things you should look at, and give some further guidance. So for example, what is risk management reporting? What should a board expect, and so on. So we put those into separate appendices. And we also expanded that. this is just the structure of the good practice guidelines, and I shall just actually go through from 1 to 3 and just try and highlight the most important points. What I'm thinking of doing is actually also pausing after each section, and if anybody has any questions, then maybe you'd like to bring it up now. Otherwise, we can take questions at the end. So the structure is very simple, really, which sort of, we're saying, what is the background? We're saying, what are the important elements of the enterprise risk management function? Because you need to establish that before you can then talk about the position of the ERM function or of the CRO. And then there are the appendices with practical guidance. So I don't know if anybody has any questions now. No, if not, I shall continue. So introduction. We started off by saying, well, if you're going to talk about an enterprise risk management function, you need to also define risk. And risk, in our opinion, and it's also, you will be able to see the same thread going through ISO 31000 and also in COSO, is that it's not just, risk is uncertainty, future events, uncertainty regarding the future. But it's not just downside risk. It's not just what can go wrong, where we can lose money in an organization, but also where we can exploit risk to earn more money. So it's both an upside and a downside potential. And the objective of ERM in this is to maintain risk at an acceptable level and to ensure that there's a balance between threats and opportunities, and, if you like, between risk and reward. So having defined risk, we could then say, well, this is what we think enterprise risk management does. It ensures that the risk exposure is balanced against the achievement of the organization's objective. Obviously, too much downside risk can mean that you can harm the financial well-being of the organization. You have the appropriate management of assets to get the best out of the assets that the company or the organization has. And I think, to me, a very important element is that in making decisions, and we make decisions in an organization, both looking in the short term, here and now, but also in the longer term. And in making decisions, we have to have some sort of idea of the future impact of those decisions. And that's where we feel very strongly that enterprise risk management has a role to play in helping to make sound decisions. So this is just a slide just sort of trying to say, well, somehow enterprise risk management tries to bind together both the detailed level, the business processes, the control activities, with the strategic level of the company's strategies and goals, and trying to make sure that they're aligned together. Another thought we had is that risk management in itself can happen at different levels in the organization. You can say that an individual at their level will try and manage the risks in their in their daily tasks and activities. And for that, there is reward. You will either be compensated because you would help achieve the objectives of the organization. And if you take perhaps too much risk or make too many mistakes, then it's going to have a negative impact. But that's a very sort of personal motivation, and it's at a personal level. The next level, we can have task risk management, where we're, for example, we want to put in we're considering purchasing a new IT system, where we'd look upon that as a separate task, a project, and then we will look at the risks compared in that project. And if you like, we'll take we'll reduce, if you like, the scope. The scope will be the project scope, and within that scope, what are the risks and how should we manage them? Enterprise management tries to be holistic. It's at the highest level, looking at the whole organization and the impact on the whole organization. And then, for those of us who have a long, I was going to say a long life in auditing, obviously we talk about internal control a lot. And in our opinion, the internal control is an integral part of risk management. And internal control is perhaps more specific and more at a detailed level, but the risk management gives you the analysis and the wider view and the cost-benefit view to dimensioning your internal controls. So we look upon internal control as a specific and integrated part of risk management. Are there any questions? If not, I shall continue. So that was describing risk management, enterprise risk management. And then the next section is looking at the important principles of the ERM function. The ERM function, in our opinion, should try and have an open line to the top of the organization because of its looking at the global aspect in the organization. And trying to align all the detailed work that happens both for risk management and internal control within a global picture. The Chief Risk Officer's role, in our opinion, would be to both, at one level, to design and implement efficient and effective processes. Perhaps you could say establish also a framework for risk management which the whole organization will follow. It is a process that should try and bring together all these various aspects. The responsibility for risk management lies, and we feel very strongly that, in the organization. So, but they need tools, they need a framework, need a common language, and that's what the Chief Risk Officer should help to do. In addition to that, we feel that the Chief Risk Officer has a standalone responsibility to monitor the risk profile. So it's not just saying, do this, but it's also looking at the result of the risk management in the organization. It's also looking ahead and trying to, on a global level, see what risks are coming up on the dashboard, what are the potential consequences of new threats and opportunities to the organization. So in one respect, it's assisting the organization to manage risk. In the other respect, it's actually having that oversight of risk. At a more detailed level, we say that risk management techniques and assessments should be used in strategy context and in the objective setting tasks. This is at the highest level. Again, the operational guidelines or framework for risk management promote the creation and preservation of risk management knowledge and establish a common risk management terminology, or as some people say, taxonomy. And then there is some clear methodology that an organization should maybe use to structure risk, both in the identification, in the evaluation, and in the monitoring of risks. So it's also having a methodology for that. And then also helping the organization have good risk reporting, so that the risk picture is communicated up also to the highest levels of the organization. And there are various systems one can have in place to assist in that. So seeing that risks are managed at a more detailed level, seeing that risk appetite is portioned out for the various types of risk, having key risk indicators or triggers to inform when one's going outside the accepted risk appetite. So an important role also is that of communication, to being able to communicate the risk picture to the CEO and the board, and to be able to have that dialogue. So we haven't said it here, but when in reality one is talking about what sort of personal traits a risk officer needs, or a chief risk officer, obviously it's perhaps natural that one focuses on the competence issue, that you have to understand what risk management is about. You should understand enterprise risk management. But as important as that, in my opinion, is also to be able to communicate, because it's no good if you see a risk management picture, if you see potential conflicts, if you see potential dangers in the in the development of the risk profile of the organization, if you can't communicate that effectively to the highest level so that decisions and changes can be made. So this is a slight duplication, but it's just reinforcing. You need effective risk management principles. You need to be able to communicate risk-related information. And in an organization, have a principle where risk owners own those risks, and they also own the related profits and losses connected with those risks. As I say, it's a sort of fallacy it is a fallacy to assume that because you have a chief risk officer, that the chief risk officer manages all risks. And that is not the case, because risk management happens in the organization at all levels in the organization. But the chief risk officer should be able to bring that information up by having also ways of making sure that risk is managed, and risk owners will be one of them. So there again, just an illustration of the coordinating role of the risk manager. Then moving on to responsibility. I think in all our organizations, when we had discussions, at the Nordic Baltic level, there is a responsibility at the highest level in the organization, which obviously in a commercial organization will be the board of directors, that the board has the overall responsibility to ensure that there is compliance with legal regulations and that there is sound risk management. And in our opinion, it is the board who should decide on what is the level of risk we want to take as an enterprise. In other words, also what risks, what constitutes too much risk, which can destroy the business. Executive management obviously is a level where risk management will be carried out through executive management and down into the organization. The executive management often will be the place where the job description and the mandate for the CRO is described. And in that respect, you should be able to say, well, where should the CRO be placed? What resources does it need to be able to do its, to carry out its function? What information it needs to access, and what is the responsibilities for reporting? And in our opinion, there should always be a direct reporting line from the CRO to the board, so that there is the possibility of reporting the complete risk picture, taking up risk issues, also which goes unfiltered to the board level. Here we've also say that we felt that the CRO, and using the 3 lines of defense model, which I'll come back to, but that it should be independent of the operational organization. It shouldn't feel that it is directly performing and making decisions, but it's assisting in the decision making. It's looking objectively at what is happening in the line of management organization. So a couple of terminologies we use here. One is the risk appetite. And there is also an appendix on risk appetite, which goes into more detail. But it's being able to, as an organization, think through beforehand what level of risk one wants to take and what level of risk is possible to take in order to carry out activities and realize goals. Another little expression we use is risk gaps, but what we're trying to say is that there should be a fair balance between risk and return. If we're taking so much risk that really we're exposing the return, then maybe we should reconsider. So that's what we would call a risk gap. Also, where there are certain risks that we just cannot effectively control or manage. And I guess that last situation is in the where we are today is very uppermost in our minds. And obviously with coronavirus, that's not something that anybody was able to control. Maybe some people foresaw it, but it's not a controllable risk. But maybe beforehand, and hopefully we will see when we look at this with hindsight, is that those organizations who thought ahead and said, well, we can't control this risk, but that we can have in place disaster recoveries, we can have in place business continuity programs, that we can already have thought through what do we do in an emergency, will be more resilient than those who did not. So as I said, when discussing risk, is that risk is to do with uncertainty. I have a little cheeky way of saying it. I think sometimes I sort of say to a chief risk officer, but really you're the chief uncertainty officer, because that is what the chief risk officer is trying to do, help the organization manage uncertainty. And uncertainty comes at various levels. It comes at the one level, which is pretty easy to manage, which is if you do A, then B will happen. And an example here is that drinking, if you have a cup of coffee and you drink it, then, you know, the conclusion is that having the cup of coffee there, which was full, that once you've drunk it, it'll be empty. It's a sort of A-B relationship. Then it gets a little bit more complex. Obviously, we can use statistical bases for trying to manage risks, to be able to say, well, this is based on prior experience. This is what has happened. These are the important factors. There is deviation in the outcomes, but that we can put that together. We can also look at correlation of risks and so on. That is also, if you like, technically more manageable type of risk. Investment risk is a clear example of that. But then you have the risk of, well, what happens if we do something going into an area which we've never been into before, or we try to invest in a product we've never invested in before, or we're going to sell this product that we've never done before. Well, maybe we can also try and estimate a probability distribution. We can look at comparable products and so on. But it's so we can try, the certainty is perhaps less, but we can try and manage by using statistical methods. Then there are the effects of the known unknowns. And to be honest, I feel that where we are today with the coronavirus is a known unknown. I've seen a number of articles when they talk about them as being black swans, and I don't think it is a black swan. If you read the literature, there have been a number of people saying for a long time that there is a risk of pandemic. We know there's a risk of pandemic, but we just didn't know quite when it was going to happen. And then that is obviously, as we are experiencing today, a much more difficult risk to manage. And then there are the real black swans, which are the risks that we'd never even thought about, which comes to the unknown unknowns. We just never imagined that could happen. For example, a 9/11 situation. So that's just a way of saying risk and uncertainty has various levels of complexity, and some of it we can approach mathematically, some is much more difficult to approach. But going back to decision making, that risk is important to decision making because we're trying to look at the uncertainty in the future. So there, I feel very strongly that risk management has an important role to play. By just saying, wait a moment, have you thought of the consequences? What could go wrong? What could go right? And modeling that into the decision-making process. With certain risks connected with the strategic level and so on, I think that scenario analysis also can be quite important, is to say, well, we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but let's assume what would happen if, and then just, in other words, you make a future story and then you say, well, if that happens, then we'll need to do this. So it may not have happened, but it could be saying, for example, in an investment company, what happens if the trade war between China and the US should escalate? What would that mean for interest rates? What would that mean for businesses? What would that mean for exchange rates? So it's trying to say, well, this could happen, and then it could have a knock-on effect. And you may say, well, in the first instance, it only affects the US and China, but then you could say, well, if interest rates change in the US, then it's going to affect in Europe, and then it will affect in my country. So it's trying to think through what could possibly happen. And obviously, maybe there's one or two lucky organizations who actually said, well, what would happen if there was a pandemic? What would that do to our market? What would that do to our business? But it's just a way of trying to say, well, we're not sure if this will happen. This may not happen, but if it does happen, how would we tackle it? And it builds up that resilience within an organization. Stop for a moment there. Is there any questions? If not, I shall carry on. The next section is on organization and segregation of duties. We talk about the 3 lines of defense models, which for internal auditors, I feel is very well known, and hopefully also for those in risk management and compliance positions. But basically, this is just a model to try and say what are our various roles, and to say that the role of risk management lies in the second line. It's not responsible for day-to-day decision-making, but it's responsible for facilitating those decisions and for monitoring the overall position. So it's assisting the first line there. The role of internal audit is one step further removed. In other words, internal audit also doesn't have a day-to-day responsibility for the decision-making in the organization, but it also has a responsibility to look at the whole organization, including the first and second line, and the systems and processes to make sure that they are working effectively. And as we said initially, also seeing that there is sound governance in the organization, sound risk management in the organization. And the internal audit should provide that assurance at the highest level in the organization. So going back to the risk management role and the second line of defense role, it is both a proactive and a reactive role. In other words, by building up the systems, by trying to look at potential future developments, by looking at the whole picture, it's trying to influence decisions at a strategic level. But at the same time, it is also monitoring what's happening in the organization, what's changing in the risk profile of the organization. And that is a more reactive role to say, well, we need to strengthen controls, we need to be more aware of this in our decision-making process. So the second line of defense has a very important role in developing and the governance generally of the organization and identifying deviations. Then we also wanted to look at how should we try and work together between the second and third line of defense, assuming we have an organization which has that structure of the 3 lines of defense. Should we have completely autonomous entities in the second and third line? Are we compromising the objectivity, for example, of the internal audit if they have too close a dialogue with the second line of defense? In my opinion, no. I think there's a lot that we have of similarity in that both functions are not responsible for the day-to-day operations. and we have a common objective, which is to help our organizations be successful and sustainable in the longer term. The second line also provides important input to the third line, to the internal audit. Internal audit should, according to the standards we need to as internal auditors, to have our own risk management process, but an important element of that risk management, risk evaluation, not risk management, and risk evaluation in connection with designing the audit plan, what we should be spending our time and effort on in the coming period, but that risk evaluation, a very important input to that will be information that comes from both the risk management and compliance functions, as well as various other sources. And if this works well, if there is good openness and cooperation and trust between the second and the third line, I feel it can help better focus, and we can ensure that we're not duplicating activities. I see very little point of that, so that we can see that are we monitoring on a global basis as well, and that the work of the third line of defense, internal audit, should be also important feedback to the second line. And I know from personal experience that when we've done audits, that we've gone out and we're looking down into the details of the organization and processes, that we can give some insight back to the second line to help them manage, to help them to see how we're managing the total risks, both operational and other risks. So it's difficult to say categorically that enterprise risk management should be here or there. We do feel that it is a strength to have it as a separate unit reporting to the chief executive. We do feel that it's a strength if it's also closely, has a close cooperation or organizational position close to other risk and control functions. But we also accept that it'll depend on the size of the organization. Obviously, if you're a small business of 50 people, it may be that it's not possible to have a full-time chief risk officer. But I think by saying the function of the enterprise risk management, we can say, well, maybe somebody in the organization, maybe the chief financial officer should have a little extra hat on his head saying risk management. I also manage risk. I don't just do the financial reporting and so on, but I also manage the risk of the organization. So the idea is then that a large organization can afford to have a more separate function than perhaps we'll see in a smaller organization. But however it is, we believe it should be defined. We should have thought through as an organization, how do we expect that position to be functioning, and what authority and what competence and what resources we want to give that position. One of the clear messages I got when I was talking to chief risk officers is that one of the difficulties one has is to say, you put out a job advert for a chief risk officer. How do you define what you require of a chief risk officer from say an academic background, what sort of competency do you require? It's a lot easier for us in internal audit. We can say, well, you know, we'd like a person who has audit experience, and there are qualifications. We can say we would require as a minimum that a person is a certified internal auditor, because that shows that they at least understand the role and the responsibilities of internal audit. But there is no equivalent today for the risk management profession. It may come in time, but not today. So that's a challenge. And it's also a challenge, I think, from the point of view of that it's very easy to focus on specific competencies, going back to when we're talking about managing uncertainties. I mean, a grounding in statistics and would be very helpful to be able to manage uncertainty, which can be arrived at from a more statistic and model base. But there again, there is no one qualification or background. And it's not just that. It's not just a technical competence, because as I said earlier, it's also important that one can communicate. And sometimes people who have a high level of technical competence are not the people who are good at communicating. And that is also an important aspect. And the other thing is, I think, another feedback we got from a CRO in a large organization was also the organization should think through a career path, because if maybe we bring in people from university at the lower level who've maybe got a statistical background and so on, and we can develop them further. But we need to have a way of having a clear career path, maybe with different progression in both in pay, but also in job titles, so that we can keep those persons and develop them further in the risk management organization, rather than lose them to the rest of the organization, because the rest of the organization sees the person's competence, and that person is underpaid in connection with what the other part of the organization would be willing to pay for that competence. So also having a clear picture of how you wish also to develop your staff in a large organization. Finally here, a couple of things that we feel are absolutely essential to a function of enterprise risk management. And we clearly believe, as with internal audit, integrity is important, but also for enterprise risk management, integrity is important. If you allow yourself in your opinions to be too swayed by a specific part of the organization or a specific manager to compromise your beliefs as to what is the correct and what are the risks in the organization, then you're doing a disservice to that organization. So integrity is absolutely vital. And it means, I feel sometimes as an internal auditor, it means you're not always the most popular person in the organization, but one takes upon oneself this responsibility to head up an enterprise risk management, not to be popular, but to help the organization achieve its overall objectives, its strategic objectives. And that means sometimes to challenge established ideas, maybe to challenge the risk picture, and that may go against the grain, but on the other hand, that serves the organization well. So it's understanding that the value of integrity in the organization. And there are various ways of strengthening that that integrity, and that one of them will obviously be the way you're organized, and if you're organized independent of the operational activities, and the other is how you're remunerated. If you have too much, if your remuneration is based on the performance of the organization as a, in a specific part or as a whole, then you may come in situations where there is conflict of interest. One little thing, but it's an important thing, is to also think through that if an enterprise risk management function is going to be able to function successfully, you need access to the information, necessary information regarding operations and decisions. You're looking at things in a global way. You need to have the whole picture. And there it's often good also to think through that you expect risk management also to participate in internal meetings. You could say as an observer, but also to be able to give advice. You may not be, it is good that you're not making a decision on behalf of the organization as a risk manager, but on the other hand, that you can give advice and say, wait a moment, are we following up this? Are we identifying the risks in a good way? Are there gaps? Are there matters that we should be managing better, and so on? So it's important to be able to be present in various fora where decisions are made. And then final word on reporting, that as I said earlier, that the role of an enterprise risk management function or a CRO is also to think proactively, to report to the board and executive management. I think, in my opinion, it's important to, one thing is monitoring the past and reporting this is the risk position as of today, but it's important that you can actually extrapolate from that information, which will help top management and the board see how this might develop in the future, and to see what risks or new risks need to be managed, or where existing risks should be managed better. And there will be positions where it's important that a risk management function, because if you like, one of the expertise sets will be in looking at uncertainty from a statistical standpoint, may well be required to help in analyzing risks and in reporting risks. So there can be the need for ad hoc reporting. Finally, we just have a brief mention of outsourcing, because, you know, do you have to employ a chief risk officer, or can you outsource that function? And it's also been a question that has been made to the internal audit function some ways. And I think there it's important to say, well, even if you outsource it, the responsibility for risk management is within the organization. And perhaps it's better to have that resource within your organization, to build up that competence in your organization directly by having direct employment. But there can be reasons why it makes sense to outsource. It could be because the organization is so small. It could be because you're trying to build it up and you don't have the competency today, so you need to hire in that competency to build up the position. And that's where we have often seen that the consultants have been used, for example, to help establish enterprise risk management, to help based on their knowledge of other organizations and standards and so forth, that help build up that common language, risk culture, framework, etc. So that was it, really. I just wanted to summarize the main points. And these are, I think the first thing, going back to that, is that risk management is a line management responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the chief risk officer. The second is, if you have an enterprise risk management, these are the very important things that should be in place. And these are the role it should be playing. It should ensure integration of risk management into decision making. It should have clear and open communication on risk issues. It needs to have a clearly defined mandate. It needs to be organized independently and demonstrate professional integrity. It needs access to all relevant information. It shouldn't have any significant financial-based component to its salary. And it should offer remuneration sufficient to attract and retain staff of a satisfactory caliber. So it's important also that the organization has the right competency to be able to sustain the tasks that the enterprise risk management function should carry out. I'll just here very briefly just mention the appendices. I think in the version we will make available on the website, you will see a little bit more on each of these, but I don't want to go through these in detail now. But hopefully we give some additional practical guidance in the following areas. The first one is, how should one approach ERM? How should one start off trying to look at the risk management in a global basis? What tools you need to develop? What pitfalls there have been? So it's just a very practical way to implementing ERM and monitoring ERM. And there, obviously, there will be a reference also to what is the main parts of the COSO ERM and the ISO 31000, which are the standards that are internationally accepted in this area. The second guidance is on the area of risk maturity. What do we mean by risk maturity? How can you try and evaluate risk maturity? And here we're thinking about enterprise risk management maturity. And there is a model there which was developed by a couple of members of the risk management network in Norway, which is, I think, an interesting way of trying to look at risk management, development of the risk management function in a more complete manner rather than the discrete steps and a logical progression, because it's not always a logical progression in an organization. Then there's appendix number 3 on how to bring risk into decision making. There's an appendix going in to discuss what is risk appetite, what do we mean by risk appetite, just a very simple description of that. All of these are very short little papers, just giving a flavor. Obviously, there's more detail that you can look at, but this is just sort of giving a basic understanding of what do we mean. The fifth one is more a help to the organizations where the top level, if you're a board member, for example, in an organization, what what is it, if you have the CRO makes a presentation to you, what are the questions that you should ask of a CRO to understand how the organization is managing risk management on a global basis? So it's just a very practical tool with a set of questions and a little explanation of why you would ask that question, because what you want to find out. Then there's also a short paper on ERM in the public sector. In our opinion, ERM is as relevant to the public sector as to the private sector, but in the public sector, obviously, risks are going to be slightly different. You're not talking about selling and the upside is not going to be on the financial side as such, except that the upside for a public organization would be that we can use the resources that society gives us more effectively and efficiently, and we can deliver better outcomes. So there is an upside to risk management also in the public sector. So it's just saying a little bit, okay, if you're in the public sector, how can you also use the same way of thinking to approach risk management? And the final one is a bit more detail on risk reporting, just trying to say, what are the types of risk reporting that you might expect to see in an organization at the different levels of the organization. So now I've reached the end. There's a lot of talking from me, but my final statement is risk is there, why not manage it? Now, if there are any questions, I'm quite happy to take them.
You can either use the group, the chat panel, or unmute yourself if there are any questions at all.
Ellen, the availability of the guidelines, where can people access them? Because it's a digital document, is that right?
Yes, and I think a lot of them already have downloaded it. So it's in Norway, it's on our website. And I will also make this webinar available to you after with the deck of slides. I will put them easy to find. I can send a link to all those who registered for this webinar.
And I would say in the, I was going to say in the beginning of the guidelines, we also say who were involved in the project from the various participating countries. And I would encourage you, if you read through these guidelines, if you have questions, that you give feedback to the participants, or, you know, maybe you want to just send an email to somebody in your own country who was involved, so you can write in your own language. But I think it's very important to give feedback for us who were involved in this project, because we do not feel this is the definitive final version. We feel this is our, if you like, it's a first attempt. Hopefully it's a acceptable and good attempt at trying to define what we mean by enterprise risk management and how it should function. But we want to improve it. So we need feedback to be able to improve.
Martin, do you see the chat?
No.
Okay, there's a question for you. You mentioned under part 3 that CFO could have the risk management responsibility. Why not a QHSE manager, especially in a technical production industry?
Absolutely. Why not? I agree. So that was just an example. It could be the CFO, but I agree. It could well be within the quality side, and the development in the quality function. I mean, I'm thinking of like a ISO 9001 and so on has been to that one should have a risk-based approach. You have ISO 31000, so yes, why not? Yeah.
It seems that there are no more questions. So I'm gonna